Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're decoding something we all deal with, but honestly, rarely understand: the economic realities behind rent and profit. If you've ever found yourself wondering where the extra surplus in our economy actually comes from, and more importantly, who gets to keep it, well, you are definitely in the right place. We're going to look closely at how modern economic theory defines these core concepts, how they emerge in the real world, and what they mean for businesses and for you. So let's kick things off by challenging a huge everyday assumption. When you hear the word rent, what pops into your head? Probably handing over a check to a landlord for an apartment, or maybe leasing a car, right? It's just a normal everyday transaction. But in the realm of economic theory, rent has a much deeper, highly specific, and frankly, way more interesting meaning that goes far beyond just paying for physical space. If we look at modern economics, and the brilliant Joan Robinson hit the nail on the head here, rent is actually a surplus. It's what any factor of production earns beyond the bare minimum amount needed to keep it working in its current job. Economists call this baseline minimum its transfer earnings. Basically, if you're making more than the absolute minimum required to keep you from jumping ship to another gig, that extra padding, economically speaking, that is rent. To really follow this surplus and understand business earnings, we'll break this explainer down into 5 quick stages. 1. Redefining economic rent. 2. How rent actually arises. 3. The quasi-rent concept. 4. The true nature of profit. And 5. The sources of profit. All right, let's jump right into section 1, redefining economic rent. The contrast over time here is pretty stark. Back in the day, David Ricardo had this classical belief that rent only applied to fixed land. He literally defined it as being for the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Very restricted, right? But modern economists, championed by folks like Robinson, totally reject that. The modern view argues that absolutely any factor of production can earn economic rent. It all boils down to supply elasticity. If a factor's supply is inelastic, meaning you can't easily make more of it, it can command a surplus over its transfer earnings. Which brings us perfectly to section 2, how rent actually arises. Ricardo used a really famous agricultural example for this, and it's a great way to visualize it. Imagine a society that only needs to farm its absolute best, most fertile land. Because there's plenty of it to go around, there's zero rent. But as the population grows, demand for food skyrockets. Eventually, society is forced to farm somewhat less fertile, marginal land just to feed everyone. Let's say this marginal land only yields 16 quintals of wheat per hectare. This is the catalyst. It pushes the market price up to, say, 250 rupees just to cover the higher costs of farming it. Because this marginal land is just barely breaking even, it earns absolutely no rent. But here's the kicker. The moment we're forced onto that less efficient marginal land, let's call it land B, the price of crops goes up everywhere. Because of this new higher market price, the farmers back on the original, highly fertile land A are suddenly making way more money for the exact same amount of work. So rent only emerges on the better land as a surplus value. And it's a direct result of the fact that we had to resort to the less efficient land B just to meet market demand. Let's see how this plays out in the business world in section 3, the quasi-rent concept. The great economist Alfred Marshall realized something crucial. It's not just land that has a fixed supply. In the short period, things like heavy capital equipment or factory buildings act a whole lot like land. I mean, you can't just build a new factory overnight, right? Because their supply is temporarily fixed, they can earn a surplus over the variable costs of running them. Marshall called this temporary surplus quasi-rent, which neatly distinguishes it from the permanent rent of actual land. Imagine this step-by-step scenario. An entrepreneur borrows money from a development bank for a massive new manufacturing machine. That monthly loan payment, that's a fixed cost. They owe it whether they produce one single widget or a million. Then they fire up the machine using labor and raw materials. Those are the variable costs. In the short term, any revenue they make that covers more than those day-to-day variable costs is their quasi-rent. Now, this quasi-rent might be enough to cover the bank loan and leave a pure profit, or it might just barely soften the blow of their losses. But in the short run, it is the exact surplus they are fighting for. This raises a huge question, taking us to section 4, the true nature of profit. Think about it. If rent belongs to the factors of production, like land and machines, what exactly belongs to the organizer? Economists fiercely debate this. F.P. Hawley thought profit was just a straightforward reward for insurable risk. But F.H. Knight totally disagreed, arguing that insurable risks are just standard business costs. To Knight, true profit comes from navigating non-insurable, unforeseeable uncertainties. Then you have J.B. Clark, who called profit a dynamic surplus. He argued that in a perfectly static world, an entrepreneur just earns a standard manager's wage. Profit only explodes into existence because our society is dynamic, always changing. And then there's Joseph Schumpeter. He took this really fascinating angle. He argued the profits are basically transitional. They're a temporary reward handed to an entrepreneur for a successful innovation. Once they innovate, boom, they get a burst of profit. But eventually, competitors catch up, they copy the idea, and that specific profit is entirely eliminated. Let's pull all these threads together in our final section, the sources of profit. So far from just being a gold star for taking a risk, the source material shows us that business profit actually stems from 4 overlapping sources. It comes from navigating those non-insurable uncertainties Knight talked about. It comes from relentless entrepreneurial innovations. It comes from holding monopoly power in a given market. And yes, it comes from capitalizing on imperfections within the labor market itself. Zooming in on that innovation piece for a second, Schumpeter literally laid out 5 distinct ways an entrepreneur can disrupt the market to trigger this temporary surplus. It's not just inventing a cool new gadget. You can introduce an entirely new good, discover a new method of production, open up a totally untapped market, conquer a new source for raw materials, or even completely reorganize an industry to create a monopoly. Any of these 5 moves can generate a massive wave of transitional profit. But to be perfectly clear, we also have to look at the structural, sometimes darker side of the surplus. Joan Robinson bluntly stated, profits arise due to imperfections in markets. Because the labor market is almost never perfectly competitive, workers are often paid wages lower than the actual value of what they produce, their marginal revenue productivity. This mathematical gap directly contributes to capitalist profit. It's a critical component of where business surplus actually originates. So as we wrap up this explainer, look at the big picture we've built. Rent isn't just a landlord's due. It's a surplus for anything in short supply. And profit? It's a complex, fleeting reward for uncertainty, innovation, and strategic positioning. So ask yourself, in the fast-paced, deeply dynamic economy we live in today, are you just making minimum transfer earnings? Or are you actively hunting for that dynamic surplus? Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the economics around you.